We are continuing with our study in the book of Micah. Now, this one has been a little bit of a tough one for me, so that's the reason for a longer period between the recordings. But this is talking about the last days. Anyway, let's jump right in, and go to a quick review of what we've talked about. Micah was a prophet to Judah. His name means "who is like God." Now, there were other prophets at the same time that Micah was there. Isaiah was a prophet. He was a prophet at the same time and to the same people that Micah was prophesying to. They were prophesying to the southern nation of Judah. Then there was Hosea and Amos. They were both prophets to the northern nation. The Lord was begging these prophets, not begging the prophets, through these prophets, he was begging the nations to repent and turn back to him. Chapters 1 and 2 we saw were judgments of Judah and Israel. The judgments promised that, or were a promise all the way back at the time of Moses. Now this is quite a long time after Moses. This is in the 500 BC area. Actually, the 600 BC area probably, where Micah was begging the people to turn back to God. Moses promised that there was going to be a judgment if they didn't stay with the covenant that God had made with them at Mount Sinai. Anyway, they had turned to adulterous idolatry that included human sacrifice. And that was addictive. It was like tobacco or alcohol to a person that has continued to use these things. And they claim that they can get away from it at any time, but they can't. It was very addictive. Anyway, at the end of chapter 2, we have a promise of the regathering of Israel, all of Israel, back to the land. Then chapter 3, we saw judgment of the elite of Judah. Horrible consequences for these people that were tipping the balance scale and just not being judicious in the way they lived and the way they treated other people. Things were going well, at least for those that were in control. And so there wasn't a lot of impact on the hearts of the people. Micah ministered during the time of King Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Jotham was a good king, but he compromised. He compromised by leaving the high places of idol worship standing. Ahaz was a horrible king. He was a bad guy. He worshipped these foreign gods and even offered one of his sons in sacrifice to an idol. Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, was a good king. I don't know how that happened, but he was a good king. He believed in God. And he didn't compromise. He got rid of the high places. But that wasn't enough to turn the hearts of the people back to God. Anyway, from there, we're going into chapter 4. Chapter 4 is, again, an about-face, just like the end of chapter 2 was. It's an about-face in the message. It starts with the first word, but. But in the last days. The message is clear. But it's not happening at the time of Micah. It's but in the last days, a time in the future. I talked about this with some of my Jewish friends, some of my Jewish instructors, and so forth. And I enjoyed talking with them about this. But because part of it, I'm having a hard time understanding. It doesn't fit with my bias. All of us enter the study of prophecy with a bias. Now, you can deny that you got a bias, but we all do. Micah doesn't fit quite into my bias. So you'll see that I'll come to a part that I'll kind of change my bias a little bit. Most pastors that I have listened to on this particular passage skip part of it, at least one verse. And either they skip it or one had the great honesty to admit that he didn't understand that particular verse that we're going to run into. But we're going to look at this with the outline of the mountain of the Lord, all people, and we. Before real peace, and then we're going to go back to all people and we. Starting with verse 1, Micah. But in the last days, now I told you it started with the last days, but in the last days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow unto it. Many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For the law shall go forth of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Now, there's a lot in that. First of all, the time was identified, and we've mentioned that in the last days. Now, when is that? The term is used only 9 times in the Bible, but there's similar terms that are used that still refer to that time. So let's go to the New Testament and see that term. Acts chapter 2. For you that are biblical students, you know what Acts chapter 2 is about. Anyway, in Acts chapter 2 says, But this is that which is spoken by the prophet Joel, that it shall come to pass. Now, they're pointing to the time at Pentecost, the time of Shavuot for the Jews. And it shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Now, we could go back to the book of Joel because this is a quote from his prophecy, and we would find that this is only a partial fulfillment. That is, at Pentecost, we had only a partial fulfillment. Joel was speaking during a time of locust invasion, and this was a warning picture to the people at the time of the Assyrian and Babylonian invasions. Anyway, the Lord was begging Judah to repent. The prophecy is for Judah the prophecy is that Judah would return. They would return to God. At the time of Acts, they were under Roman control, and this was a hard time for them. There was no blessing there, and their hearts were still not turned to God. Micah says that in the last days, time beyond Acts, time beyond all of the prophets, and the purpose would be that Israel would return and all would be accomplished as spoken to Abraham. If I can get my thing to go here. Go back to talking about Abraham. Now remember, his name originally was Abram, and God changed it to Abraham. Anyway, now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will shew thee. And I will make thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee. And in thee, in Abraham, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. I'm sorry my video seems to be stalling here, but hopefully we'll just continue. It says, Abraham and all of Israel were called to bless. Most Jews will tell you today that the Bible tells about their blessing. And indeed it does. They were chosen, but they were chosen to be blessed and to be a blessing to all the world. The prophet Daniel gives us a clue as to how this should be interpreted in Micah. The prophet Daniel lived in Babylon. He was taken into the Babylonian captivity. And as that captivity was foretold by Micah. Anyway, his Daniel was called to interpret the dreams, the multiple dreams of the king. The dream was disclosed, or Daniel disclosed the king's dream. That dream was disclosed to Daniel by God, and then Daniel explained this to the king as to what he was dreaming. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. The image of the head was of fine gold, his breast and arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, and feet part iron and part clay. Thou sawest till the stone was cut out without image, till a stone was cut out without image, without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, the gold, broken to pieces together, and became like chaff of the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. This mountain is the ruling empire of a time that's future that Daniel's talking about. And it's the mountain that Micah is talking about. These were repeated dreams for the heathen king. But it told of a future for the Jews and for the empire that they were living under, the Babylonian Empire. The future is now most of it is history to us. We can look back and we can see the four ruling empires that Daniel was telling about: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Then it says that the seed of the Jews is mixed, some with strength, nothing stuck together. And at the end of the image that the king saw, there were 10 toes or 10 kings, and a great stone that was cut out without hand, and it smashed this image at the toes. Then there was more info on the last days. Let's read some of that. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. Whereas thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings, that is the 10 kings, shall the 10 toes, and in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. That's the mountain that he's talking about, which shall never be destroyed. and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it break in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And the verse continues, but we don't need that for our study here in Micah. But there's a time still to come, prophesied by Joel, Micah, Daniel, Isaiah, and more prophets. God will set up his own kingdom, and there he will bless the Jews. And he will bless the rest of Israel that's lost today. The Jews are just the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin, but it will include all the tribes of Israel. Some of this has challenged my bias about the last days. Let's go back to Micah. Verse 1 again. But in the last days it shall come to pass that the mountain, remember what we saw about the mountain, that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and the people shall flow unto it. And many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the law shall go forth of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. I hope you understand this term mountain here. It's talking about governments or empire. The Lord's going to establish his own empire, and it's going to be above the hills, above the governments around it. God will teach the Jews his ways. At the time Micah was writing, they were in idol worship. God will teach the Jews his ways, and the Jews will live in his ways. And nations, Gentiles, will go up to Jerusalem and learn his ways. Zechariah tells us some things about this. Yea, many people and strong nations shall come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem, and to pray before the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass, as future days now, in those days, and it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold out of all the languages of the nations, and shall take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, We will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. This is with the Jews. Now, Zechariah was a prophet after Daniel, about 500 BC. He returned to Jerusalem from Babylon, from the Babylonian captivity. The prophecy is still future to him and future to us. But God will bless the Jews. Be a great time of peace for the Jews. Children will play in the streets, he says. I was listening to a news report just this week that showed kids playing in the streets of Jerusalem. And the news reporter was saying that this is a fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah. But he was also reporting on rockets hitting Israel. Well, it can't be a fulfillment of that because there's no peace there yet. But Micah better defined the peace that is to come. Verses 3 and 4. And he shall judge, that is, God will judge among many people, and rebuke strong nations afar off. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. but they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken it. This is a real peace that he's talking about. They're going to take the instruments of war and they're going to use that metal and whatever materials, they're going to use it for agriculture. They're going to use it to raise food. They're going to use it for the betterment of people. But God will judge among many people. No need for weapons anymore. He'll have it all under control. This has never happened before, but it will. It will. God said it, and so it's going to happen. Now, how it's going to happen, we have that described for us in the New Testament. Let's go over to the book of Revelation. And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having a key to the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the old dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that, he must be loosed a little season. Now, I don't know why God chose 1,000 years, but he's chosen it. At God's judgment, no one, he's going to bind the one that seduced Eve, and nations will not be deceived by Satan anymore. He has continued with his seducing since the time of Eve, but God will put an end to it. Satan will be bound for 1,000 years, but he's going to be loosed for a little season. He will gather his troops together and he will challenge the Lord. He will challenge God. Satan will challenge God after that 1,000 years, but it's going to end quickly. Where's Satan going to get his troops? My guess is Micah 4, verse 5. For all people will walk, everyone in the name of his God. Wait a minute, what did I say? For all people will walk, everyone in the name of his God. And we, that is the Jews, and we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. For all people will walk, everyone in the name of his God. This is during the time of God's kingdom. My previous understanding of the 1,000 years was that only believers would enter that time. But that looks like it's untrue from what Micah is saying. I listened to many pastors teach on this, and only one of them was honest enough to admit that he didn't understand what verse 5 was talking about. The others just skipped it. I asked 3 of my Jewish Hebrew instructors about this verse. 2 of them were biblical Hebrew instructors, and they analyzed the verse as being poetic. And one of them actually translated that verse. Let me back up, look at the word and. For all people will walk, everyone in the name of the Lord, and. Now that particular instructor and it translated that as but the Jews will walk in the name of the Lord their God. The but would certainly emphasize a contrast there, but the word really is and. The poetic rules of interpretation allow that to be interpreted as a but that's based on a bias. Now, all of us have a bias, believe it or not. Even I do. But the other biblical Hebrew teacher would not even give an interpretation, just read the verse and said, these words are straightforward, there's no need to interpret it. Anyway, the third Hebrew teacher is a modern Hebrew teacher, and he's still waiting on a rabbi to give him a response as to what that means. So we had to go ahead here. Anyway, I believe that my previous position about all entering that as believers is not correct. Some unbelievers will evidently enter, but what happens to cause peace? Micah 4:5 again. For all people will walk every one in the name of his God, and we will walk in the name of our God forever and ever. The Jews are special. God chose them for a special task. God chose them to reveal himself to the world. We're going to see more of what happens in the future as we continue here. Let's jump over to the book of Daniel again and look at chapter 12 and verse 1. It says, and at that time shall Michael, that's the archangel, and at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people, the children of the Jews. And there shall, listen to this, and there shall be a time of trouble. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to the same time. Daniel's writing at the time they're in Babylonian captivity. And starting again, and at that time shall Michael stand up, that the great prince that standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered. The Jews are going to be delivered. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Everyone that shall be found written in the book. Thy people is talking about the Jewish people, probably talking about all of Israel there, but this is referring to a 7-year period that precedes the 1,000 years that we saw in our discussion here so far. But the 1,000-year will be a time of the reign of Christ. There's a 7-year period before that. The Jews have a time of trouble worse than Hitler, worse than the others of the past. It will begin with and I'm paraphrasing a lot of scripture here, but it will begin with a deceptive time of peace. One will declare peace to gain control. But how do they get their name written in the book? Middle of that 7-year period of trouble, this man that had declared peace is going to change. He's going to defile the newly built temple and start a horror that we call the tribulation, a horror on the Jews. Jeremiah spoke of that time. He lived in a time of horror. I'm telling you, Jeremiah lived in a horrible time. This was the time that they were off in captivity, and they had taken everybody off, and they had leveled Jerusalem. There was no food there. Most of the people decided to go down into Egypt to escape the horrible time that they were experiencing. Anyway, here's what Jeremiah wrote. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. That's what we read about before. For it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, that I will break his yoke from off thy neck, and I will burst thy bonds, and strangers shall no more serve themselves of him. But They shall serve the Lord their God, and David their king. That is, the Jews are going to serve the Lord their God, and David their king, whom I will raise up unto them. Many are going to die during that 7-year period. Half of the world's population is going to die. Jews and Gentiles. Jews are especially going to be the targets, though, of Satan's attack and this Antichrist that we call him. But God promised to save them, and they will serve under the throne of David. Let's see how that happens. It actually is mentioned there in verse 9 that we just read. Let's back up and just pick it up. Verse 9, but they shall serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up unto them. Let's see what Zechariah has to say about that time. I will pour upon the house of David, and I will pour upon the house of David. David was the great king of Israel. And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication. And they shall look upon me, whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him, as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him, as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. Listen to that. Consider what this is saying. Roughly 500 BC this was written. They, the Jews, shall look upon me, whom they have pierced. Who is me? Well, let's go back to the beginning of that chapter and see what it says. Chapter 12, verse 1. And the burden of the word of the Lord for Israel, saith the Lord, which has stretched forth the heavens, and laid the foundations of the earth, and formeth the spirit of man within him. They shall look on me whom they have pierced. The Lord is the one that's speaking. He is the me. He is the one who stretched forth the heavens. He is the one that laid the foundations of the earth. He is the one that formed the spirit of man within him. He's also the one who was pierced. This is an important message, folks. The Jews shall look upon me whom they have pierced. Yes, they probably pierced the heart of God with worshiping of idols. But there's more to it than that. Isaiah chapter 7, starting with verse 10. Moreover, the Lord spoke again unto Ahaz. Now, Isaiah was writing at the same time that Micah was prophesying. This particular passage, he's talking to Ahaz, the horrible king. Moreover, the Lord spoke again unto Ahaz, saying, Ask thee a sign of the Lord thy God, and ask it either in the depth or the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. This guy was a pagan. He's not going to talk to God. He's not going to ask for a sign because he doesn't want to know God. Continuing, and he said, Hear ye now, O house of David. This is God speaking. And he said, Hear ye now, or actually it's Isaiah speaking for God. And he said, Hear ye now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will ye weary my God also? For the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, most pay more attention to the virgin than they do the last part of it, but that's important. Isaiah prophet again at the same time as Micah, and God promised a sign. A virgin would conceive and bear a son. Now that happened 500 years later. Excuse me, much longer than that. They were before the return. This is 750 years before. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son. He will be Emmanuel, and there it is in Hebrew. Emmanuel. Emmanuel, God with us. God with us. Matthew 1, verse 18 says, Now the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise. When his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, that is, they were engaged, we'll put it that way, espoused to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Ghost. And we'll skip a few verses and go down to verse 22. Now, all this was done that it might be fulfilled. That first part is the virgin birth. And now all this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Behold, a virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. Now don't get tied up with the difference in spelling here. We've gone through a different language here, and they're transfiguring, they're moving it from Greek to English, and it's an E sound in the Greek, it's an I sound in Hebrew. They shall call his name Emmanuel, which being interpreted is God with us. Jesus is Emmanuel. He's the one that was born of the Virgin. Emmanuel means God with us. God actually came to the earth, took on a physical body for 33 years, and fulfilled the sign, not 500 years earlier, but 750 years earlier. Sorry about that. Then we see over in John chapter 1 and verses 1 through 3. It says, In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by excuse me. All things were made by him. Stretched forth the heavens, laid the foundation of the earth, formed the spirit within man. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And we skip down a few verses so that we see who this Word is. And the Word was made flesh. That's Jesus. And dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, Emmanuel. Jesus stretched forth the heavens. Jesus laid the foundation of the earth. Jesus formed the spirit of man within him. Jesus was judged. Those that judged him couldn't agree on what to charge him with. He was found innocent of everything. But the Jews cried, Crucify him, crucify him. John chapter 19, verse 34 says, But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced 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 his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. Jesus' hands were pierced. Jesus' feet were pierced. Jesus' side was pierced. And the genealogy of Jesus shows that he comes from the kingly line of David and should have been in line to be the king and is in line to be the king. Zechariah 12:10. And I will pour out upon the house of David, called Jesus, and I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication. By grace and supplication are we saved. And I will pour upon the house of David, the Jews, and I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the rest of Israel, and the spirit of the grace of supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him, as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him, as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. Now, this is how it will happen. The people of Jerusalem, the Jews, will mourn because they will recognize him whom they have pierced. They will recognize God with us, Emmanuel. He was put to death. They will believe on him as Messiah. The Jews will be saved. Folks, we're all sinners. We all need to look upon Jesus and recognize our own sin, for which Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, died and shed his blood to cleanse us, to make us righteous. His grace is available. He died to pay the required price that was announced to Adam and Eve, that death was required for sin. But Jesus didn't stay dead. He rose the third day, and he wants to be with us eternally. The Jews will mourn. We should mourn also. Much more could be said on all of this. But let's go back to Micah. Micah 4:5. For all people will walk every one in the name of his God, and we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. I believe this is saying that all Israel who survived that 7-year tribulation period are going to be saved. All Israel who survive will enter the 1,000 years that Jesus will reign. Jesus as David, the king, and he will reign in peace. Many Gentiles will recognize Jesus. Many of them will be saved. Some Gentiles will not recognize Jesus. They will enter that 1,000-year period also. They will worship their own God. It's likely that they will join Satan at the end of that 1,000 years, because Satan's going to be loosed and he's going to gather an army to go after God. What a stupid thing. But then following that judgment of Satan and those that follow him is going to be judgment, and there's going to be a new heaven and new earth. And all those that are left will be entering therein. This study could go on, and it would be profitable for us to do so. But remember where we began. We began with the mountain of God. That is the empire of God. He will establish his kingdom on earth. That is a for sure event that's to come. Prior to that kingdom, there's going to be 7 years of tribulation. It's going to be horror, but it's going to drive the Jews back to the land, and they're going to recognize Jesus, Emmanuel, and Jesus the King under David's rule, under the promise that the seed of David would rule forever. They will recognize him whom they have pierced, and they will grieve over that. But then they're going to be saved for eternity. Jesus was pierced for the sin of the world. Yes, the Jews, but for the Gentiles also. Others will survive the 7-year horror. They'll be in 2 camps. Some will go to Jerusalem to be instructed to meet the one that created all. The others will not go, and possibly they will join Satan at the end to be destroyed. We can learn all of this from Daniel, Revelation, Micah, Isaiah, Jeremiah. All of this is described in the prophets. But we will also learn about the final judgment. It will happen also. You must have your name written in the book of life. And Jesus is the way. He says he's the way, the truth, and the life. That's the way you get your name in the book of life. Judgment is either to eternal life or eternal condemnation. That's specifically called out in the book of Daniel. We didn't cover what happened to believers of today. The Lord will take them out of the world before that tribulation period. But today we can recognize that we are indeed sinners. And if you haven't already, we can look upon Jesus, who was pierced, and his blood that covers all, Jews and Gentiles. And we can receive him today to avoid that tribulation time. Maybe soon, maybe a while, don't know. We can receive him to avoid the judgment that comes after the 1,000-year period, to live with him eternally. Romans chapter 10, verses 9 and 10 tell us that if thou shalt confess with thy mouth, that if you will confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. Folks, the Lord wants us all to be there. We can all receive Jesus. If you haven't done so, please consider it now. That tribulation time may be immediately, and it says in the description of that this one that comes in peace is going to deceive everyone. Folks, now is the time. Receive Jesus. Thank you for listening.